Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. And actually, when you look at this room, the concepts that Keith and Richard were talking about just recently, actually, there is a self-actualization going on in this group of people, and I'm incredibly happy to be addressing a group where the gender balance looks 50-50 to me. So, and I'm here to give you exactly 20 minutes of insight into the kind of structural changes that have gone on in the UK, the structural changes that we anticipate, and how it is that you should be thinking about the UK and also the rest of Europe and so on in terms of your own futures and so on. So online advertising is a great career to pick in the UK. I can see lots and lots of wonderful young people. You'll be at it for the rest of your lives, and it will become more and more interesting. I myself have been involved in this sector for over 20 years. Really 23 years, actually. It's incredible. So the UK has always had the highest level of online advertising spend per capita in Europe since 1996. I think that the key reason really has to do with the fact that the UK is the bedrock of innovation in the global advertising industries. We are the creators of some of the major concepts, global brands, and many, many innovations, of which Keith was just talking about, even more innovations coming from a UK-oriented culture in the world. So the other reason why online advertising is much more significant here, even than in the US, is because we have the highest share by far, and always have, of online purchases. So e-commerce has been a major force in this country since it started with Amazon. When Amazon had a very small number of customers in the late 90s, those people were spending, on average, around £3,500 to £4,000 a year on Amazon, which was very substantial 20 years ago. And now that Amazon has many, many millions of customers, it has around, say, 9.5 to 10 million Prime customers in the UK alone. And Prime customers are very intensive customers. So, you know, in a nation of around 67 million people, you know, that's a very substantial and very fast-growing base. And those people are all spending £4,000, just like the people in the 90s did. So that gives you an idea also of why it is that Amazon is such a powerful force, and why advertising to people in the online space is so powerful. There are many other features to the UK that make this the locus of the highest consumption activity based around the home. We are the world beaters in terms of home ownership, credit card possession, speed of change of homes. You know, people move a lot, very aspirational. And we have also always been people who are very, very busy. 70% of women in this country work part-time or full-time. So there is an optimization of life and a culture of optimization of life, which is completely absent, may I say, in places like Italy, where I'm afraid you can see that 2.6 billion euros compared to 15.6 billion euros. And Italy is exactly the same size of population as the UK. France is also of a very similar size. Germany, of course, is a nation of 36 million homes, so it's much bigger. But notwithstanding that, you can see how the culture of retailing, the culture of life, in Italy, where there is mass unemployment among the young, only 20% of women work at all, part-time or full-time. So that's why, you know, it's going to be a little difficult for these countries to catch up. They're never going to catch up. The UK is a powerhouse economy. So just looking at China for a second, so you can see that as a percent share of GDP, the UK is even above China. Now, China has leapfrogged a huge number of retailing phases, like, you know, online basically took over when the country became very, very prosperous. And, you know, essentially, China is by far the biggest e-commerce market in the world in terms of a completely new market, in terms of advertising. But actually, the US and the UK are much more mature and much more elaborate markets with much higher levels of consumption among the population as a whole. So China will, of course, always be at the top of the league tables because of its sheer size, you know, as India will one day be. But you can see that, you know, there are a lot of profound cultural elements here that cause us to believe that the UK will always be at the forefront of the world in terms of innovation in advertising. Isn't that good news? That's good news. Come on, cheer up. Okay, so, and we have already, of course, the only nation with the US to have passed this great point where, you know, very mature, very developed, very elaborate TV business is trumped by online advertising. But that's not the way to see it, because in fact, there is no zero-sum game. I will explain to you the zero-sum game, the absence of a zero-sum game on the last slide, but Keith alluded to it. Advertisers here over-advertise to people because they're innovative, they want to try things, and then they have all of their existing systems which deliver the bread and butter of their business. So we actually have a very high level of advertising aimed at people, and also because we have a very alert and very intelligent group of people in this country who are very, very difficult to persuade. So of course you have to over-advertise to people who are very picky about how they spend their money. Elsewhere where there's very low consumption, you don't even need to bother, and you can see that in the previous slide. People aren't even bothering advertising. So by 2020, and I will give you a little bit more detail on this chart, by 2020, for some reason that chart it says 35. Please ignore that. This is not slide 35. This is only the second one. Anyway, but by 2020, you know, we can see that there's going to be a further very substantial progression. And, you know, we believe that the IAB universe, ex-broadcaster video on demand, will rise to around 60% by that time of total advertising, which will be around 23 billion, and it will carry on rising forever. So, you know, essentially we are many, many years away from maturity. This is a system change, and it's supported by a very, very complex supply chain of data, and one in which the advantage really lies with those people who have the most data and who know the most about how to use it. So why will television be still so significant in 2020 with only a small drop in its actual placing? That's because TV is actually the core locus of branding. And it has remained that for the 23 years in which the conversation has been taking place about how online can address brands. It also has massive reach, so it has much, much greater reach across the UK population. And above all, in the UK, we have a locus of a situation where the majority of the population is aged over 40, and the majority of consumption is now post-43. So you've got the biggest consumers and the biggest wealth owners who are well past their prime, like me. But, sorry, age-wise anyway. But the fact is that they're watching a lot of television. So we have a very intensive, very high-quality television culture, and that is constantly renewing demand. Obviously, there is an issue, which is that the Netflix has been taking a lot of viewing away in the younger demographics, and also now increasingly the older ones. But essentially, television is very cheap and very, very effective. The world is changing for other reasons, but TV is always in this country is always going to be by far the most effective medium in terms of those requirements. So within this extraordinary industry, you know, the duopoly of Facebook and Google has now been joined by Amazon. Amazon has been the fastest growing medium in the UK for 2 years now, and it is definitely the third force. It's consumer data and knowledge of consumers is definitely a huge advantage versus Twitter or Snap or any of the news brands. We live in a scale world. These companies have scale, and many other companies have only one choice, including mine, which is to differentiate very, very strongly and to be super clever about the absence of data by using all the data that there is in the world to be cleverer than these companies can be, at least briefly, to survive. The other thing that's very interesting about this is the impact that online is having on essentially on our business life. So we've had massive entry of new companies in the UK. The only industrial growth that there has been in the UK since 2010 has been in small companies. Big companies have been losing staff all the way through the last 20 years. And since 2010, around 2.9 million businesses have started in the UK, most of which are supported by Facebook or Google or both. And you can see with this chart that Amazon itself has a whole flotilla of specialized merchants, and ISBA is basically in that different universe. So we're looking at very complementary forces acting upon the world as we know it, the business world, and above all, our economy. The economy is the most important aspect of driving advertising, as I'm sure you know. When we have a terrible economy and the world has gone to hell, all of the situation is difficult. But 2008, 2009, it was not difficult for online advertising. So I can also predict to you that if there is a major recession, which is bound to happen one of these days, everybody in this room is still going to be fine, okay? Anyway, so the major shift has really been, as you all know, towards the aspects that Keith was talking about, direct relationships between brands and consumers, huge amounts of data banks, propulsions, essentially, rewards for buying, or essentially triggers to buying being the key aspect. The UK has always had a gigantic economy triggered around getting shoppers to shop and getting them to have loyalty to brands. There is a huge amount more to come in terms of growth from that part of direct advertising and support, for instance, trade promotions and so on. But one of the reasons why the direct response formats have taken over, apart from the fact that companies can operate them, companies like Unilever and many other companies, is actually because the number of global brands has dropped. So I'm sure you know that the number of companies quoted on stock exchanges has gone down by 20% in the last 15 years, 20%. That's because of consolidation. The smaller brands are not able to survive in this world, so they get absorbed by the bigger ones. And those brands themselves are actually very picky about the ones they want to promote. And the new brand creation is crafty, differentiated brands which don't need traditional TV advertising. So we're looking at a very strong industrial shift, which is unlike that we have seen in the last 100 years. Very exciting times. Unfortunately, they're not great times for newspaper publishers because online advertising only brings $1 billion a year to content creators and publishers, and a lot of that money goes to YouTube creators. So essentially, what we're seeing is a situation where publishers are moving to support their content, and this is very important for our society because news sites, especially our news sites, dominate the world of knowledge globally. I'm talking about the FT, the Times, and so on. These are very, very important publications for the world at large. How are they supported? Increasingly by cover price. Please don't worry about them. They'll all be fine. We'll keep helping them. So this slide is important because you can see the scale effect and the value of scale in terms of where we are today. And even companies that have been online forever and claim 10 million viewers a month, views a month, like The Guardian, have basically a very, very small amount of data, and it's of very little use to them. And in fact, their investment in managing data is really very, very difficult for them to sustain. I mean, how can a business that turns over £220 million a year, that's The Guardian, be actually in a position to match the business of Google in terms of any aspect of the delivery of its advertising? So inherently, we're going to see an accentuation of the dominance of the first, basically, major folks. And you can see the importance in television terms of the Sky Virgin Alliance, which supports Sky's great long-term investment in AdSmart and addressable and programmatic advertising for television, which is what is driving the growth in TV. That is it. So essentially, we're going to a world in which your industry, as we heard today a lot already, the gold standard, this is a very important part of a maturing process. The industry has been very Wild West. There have been many, many inadequate aspects to it. So you're looking at a situation where I can tell you for nothing that I have never seen in my long career, which is now almost 40 years, in the UK advertising and television industry, I've never seen major media survive unless they protect consumers. And this consumer protection is the locus of the entire European regulatory system with regard to content on television, on radio, and on newspapers. And if I were to tell you that a newspaper will not upload a video to their website unless they have checked it visually, you would understand how it is, and they are regulated to do that, how it is that although regulation cannot keep up with the scale of innovation, it is going to force companies that say, I don't care for regulation, because the US Act told me that, I'm not a publisher, I'm not responsible, we're going to see an end to that, and we're going to see an end to that very quickly. I don't believe that Matt Hancock is right, that you can impose limits on online time on anyone in this country. I just don't think that's going to be possible, but I do think that voluntary aspects of this are extraordinarily important. For instance, do you all think that it's possible for YouTube, when it is the same size as Channel 4, which will be in 2020, for YouTube to have no controls on advertising and no controls on content? Do you think that's possible? I don't. So if YouTube wants to become substantial, just like Sky, let's not forget, Sky launched in 1989, and by 1996, the adverts were under regulation because it was inappropriate, considered inappropriate to have the kinds of adverts that Sky had on. So actually, all folks in this country, to survive, to become part of this whole sustainable and beautiful world, they all have to respect the values that Keith was expounding on stage, and which I think we are the most value-driven country, and that's one of the reasons why the efforts that we're making to modernize our country are so important. We have a chance to make a beautiful world and a beautiful future. Within that, you can see that what I was just pointing out is 2009, that big drop in the overall mass. So the level of over-advertising, that will continue. And what I really hope is that we will see that online media take the same level of responsibility for their content, for their impacts, and above all, for their societal impact, as all of the offline media have been forced to do. Now, they didn't do it willingly, but after 40, 50 years of regulation, you won't find any company, Channel 4, ITV, or the BBC, any of these companies, obviously BBC doesn't take ads, but you won't find any of these companies not trying to hit the highest standards in the world for editorial. Thank you very much.